Jator, a very warm welcome back to the Deep Life Podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Warm welcome received, and it feels warm.
I'd like to begin by laying down some framework as we're going to dive deep into specifically some parts of us today, the inner critic and self-saboteur. As we grow up and develop through our childhood, teen years, adolescence, we develop all these parts of us that become our identity. We kind of listen to the narratives, the stories, the thoughts that become beliefs. And a big part of something that Dan and I are going through right now is we're kind of transitioning into, perhaps you could say, newer, evolved versions of us that want to accomplish certain things. We're beginning to recognize a lot of doubt, a lot of fearful thoughts, a lot of criticizing thoughts. And I don't think, please correct me if I'm wrong, that Dan and I are special in this case. I believe everybody has these inner critics, inner saboteurs, maybe that are telling them they're not good enough. But if you could, in your best way, maybe describe how the inner critic versus the saboteur can possibly show up in our lives. I know it will be individual based on, the stories that we all have in our unique ways, but maybe some examples so that we can better identify and become aware of these thoughts from the critic and saboteur that may present itself.
Well, that's a great question. And I'll do my best. And I hope that, anything that I share is I hope anyone that listens notices how much they criticize, judge, or even sabotage me. And why I say that is it's really important from my perspective for us to all get really clear and notice ourselves as often as we can, because without that noticing, at least in my opinion, it's very challenging to shed any of these behaviors or these patterns that we have, inclusive of self-sabotage, inner critic, overwhelming fear, overwhelming anxiety, depression. In the same breath, I'd also like to say that all of that experience is normal and is okay and is part of the process of feeling the spectrum of emotion as a human being and kind of parsing apart slowly where those original experiences came from and how much they influence us today. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So yeah, it's really important to notice that a lot of the inner critic, the self-sabotage aspects of us, I'd ask us all to consider that what you're actually hearing when you're hearing those voices in your head is typically not your voice. It may sound like you, but it's typically the values of your parents or your family of origin. And I'm going to put a little caveat there. It's typically your experience of the values of your parents or family of origin that you attach to and then made their truth, which is then the truth that you tried to be loyal to meet the needs of the family of origin. Again, whether that's mom, dad, brother, sister, or somebody else. So typically you're hearing the voices of your parents in your heads based on their values, your experiences of their values. And that's how you judge and criticize yourself as to where you are today in life. So does that make a little bit of sense?
It absolutely does. And I love the caveat of the values that you placed in there because that
Mhm.
takes it to a deeper level.
Yeah. So we have these values that we were surrounded by as children, and we did a lot of assuming, as we do still today. I still do a lot of assuming. And we built these structures about who we experienced our parents to be and who we experienced their values to be. And then we built those structures to figure out who we need to be to fit within those systems. So a family is a system. It's not, there's no separation. Like when you talk about the body, right? There's no separation between the gut and the brain. Of course, we like to look at it like it's separate, but it's not. In the same sense, any family is actually is a structure within itself. It's a body.
Mm.
And so every part of that body is playing a role, and we did too as children. And we're often very afraid or ashamed, and we hide ourselves within that structure and act out behaviors to either meet the values that we perceive our parents to have, one way to fit in, or go in the opposite direction, become like the black sheep, or the person who gets bad. Let's just say parents' values are good grades, so we become the kid that gets bad grades.
Mhm.
And those are all ways that we're learning to get into attention within the family structure. And we will, if we have an older brother, let's say older brother is playing the role of meeting all of the parents' needs and is kind of the golden child. The younger child below that will see that and ask internally questions. Can I get the amount of attention? Can I compete with that? And if I can't compete with that, then I'll act out a different behavior to try to get attention in that way.
Mm.
Mhm.
So it'll typically oscillate between first, second, third, fourth, and kind of go back and forth. Okay. So we have all of these structures, these values. By the way, it's all made up inside of us, right? We have really no idea what's going on. We're just kind of making this up as we go
Right.
along, trying to figure out how to survive within the family structure, and essentially get the most amount of attention that we can within the family structure. And as we grow up, which is a paradox in and of itself, as we grow, um, very, very few of us shed those original structures and values and perspectives of who we think we are within the family. And so as we're growing and then moving out of the house, etc., we're still carrying all of those values and structures with us. And because very few of us shed that, we often don't shed that because we're extremely loyal to the family. And loyalty is typically out of fear. You're loyal often out of fear, not out of respect. So if I'm not loyal to this family structure, then I will lose who I am in the family structure. And therefore, I will keep that family structure with me everywhere that I go and act that out in my life, no matter where I am.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a little confusing for me too. And so then we're moving through life with loyalty to these values that aren't even ours. And every decision that we make as adults is often viewed through the lens of those original values and who we thought we needed to be within that family structure. And that's where the inner critic starts to be born. It's essentially your parents, your experience of your parents living on your shoulders, and you're seeing your actions, your choices, everything that you do in your life through the lens that you think they have about you.
Mm-hmm.
So we criticize ourselves. We beat ourselves up. We're never good enough. We're never enough. Or we go to the opposite polarity where we're the golden child and we're always overachieving, and that's never enough. So we're always doing the most amount, let's say, in life, and it's never enough. It's never satisfactory. On either end of that spectrum, whether you're criticizing yourself for never attaining it and being the most, or you're criticizing yourself for being the least, we're still acting those things out through our family structure and criticizing ourselves because in one sense, we don't even have our own values to evaluate ourselves through. We're using someone else's value structure to evaluate self, which is what we did when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have that, that's like the critical part. Then the saboteur part is also very interrelated with this. The saboteur part, from my perspective, comes in to ensure that you stay stuck in that family structure. So if you're acting out behavior that moves out of who you believe yourself to be within that family structure, you can do that for a time, but often you will then sabotage yourself to realign yourself with who you deeply believe yourself to be within the family structure. So you criticize yourself, you sabotage yourself, in an attempt to remain who you, not at this conscious level, to remain who you think you are in the family. And it's a very, very hard pattern to break, because not only do you have these kind of psychological constructs going on, you also have a lot of physiological nervous system experiences that are deeply rooted in your body. And quite frankly, most of us, including myself, are walking around majority of the time fucking hypnotized by all of this. Literally. And, I drove to go play ice hockey this morning, and I know there were parts of that drive that I was completely gone. Just my body was was doing this. And, it can function that way because it's done, I've driven enough times to do that so I can check out. But majority of us are checked out 99.9% of the time. And because of that, these things are very hard to shed. And then there's this perspective that these things should be easy to shed. And they're not. There's also a perspective that these things and experiences and challenges, there's a lot of people who believe that's wrong. And my perspective is it's right. It's right because all of what I've said so far, while maybe be painful, disheartening, scary, all those other things, all of those experiences eventually can invite in the reflection to learn from all of those experiences and, oh, wow, what values are actually mine? How do I change my values? This is interesting. How do I change my values, not from a place of fuck you family, but from a place of respect of my family? Because either way that you go about this change process, if it's, I hate my family and I want to be different, and my parents are living on my shoulders and I'm criticizing myself through their voices all the time, I'm going to do this totally different. You're still bound to changing because of the family system.
Mm.
And if you don't respect from where you came, how can you respect yourself?
Mm.
You are your parents, whether you like it or not. Your DNA is theirs. You're not their behaviors, you're not their choices. You don't need to approve or disapprove how they live life. My perspective is, though, you absolutely have to learn how to respect from where you came so that you can be, I'll say reborn, but really what I mean is just all of these layers and casings and masks dwindled down as much as you possibly can. I don't know that there's ever not masks. I'll just say that, but
Sure.
dwindled down as much as we can to move from a place of respect for ourselves and where we came, not out of a place of approval or disapproval from where we came.
Mm.
How do we turn the inner critic toward our parents, and how do we sabotage as well our relationship with ourselves about our parents? Um, I don't know where we just went, but it sounded fun.
No, I love it. There's so much to unpack with it. But what a powerful reframe you just gave, Dan and I and listeners, to really honor this human journey. As, in my opinion, I believe I chose to come into this family to learn from and learn through. Um, it is challenging at times, layer upon layer. But yes, and such a beautiful reminder that I need, because I would and do tend to label myself as a black sheep and kind of revolt against family dynamics. But in the recent months and probably year, I have tried and am trying to honor these parts of me that can get really upset with my upbringing, and recognize that I'm still choosing this and still trying to learn and grow, and really observe their behaviors and the way that they talk to other members in my family as well as myself, because I know that that's just a reflection of their inner dialogue and how they grew up from the generations before them, my grandparents and great grandparents. This is all stems from, lineages and probably past lives, if you want to, if that's your thing and believe in that. But it goes back so far that at times there's a very big part of me that feels overwhelmed to dissolve these patterns that I've chosen to learn through, and I guess I'll use the word transcend in the best way that I know how. But it comes full force every now and then, and I find it challenging to almost bring loving awareness to it, instead of immediately trying to change it.
Yeah,
So
can I say something there?
Sure, yeah.
That I think is an important piece. Before I jumped on this podcast, my partner asked, how you feel about the podcast. And it's like, I really I want to really bring some stuff for people to, all of this stuff can get very convoluted. And
Mm,
so I want to try to offer also people some like concrete things to do and also things to notice. Um, and so something to notice or to consider is that um, the more your experience of your family's behaviors for all of us
mm,
still flare you up or cause a lot of that implies, at least from my perspective, that there's still parts of you that either act out similar behavior
mm,
in different places in your life, maybe not literally, it could be a metaphor. Act out similar behavior either somewhere else in your life or towards yourself. It could also imply, back to this inner critic, that you're still a part of you and part of me too, very critical of when you did act out those behaviors
mm,
or when you were still very expressive of those kind of family dynamics that you learned, and you're still doing it and critical towards self. The more exploration one does and processing these deep emotions and past experiences and integrating those things, the more the lens of compassion will be seen when you look at your family.
mm,
Um, I'll use myself as an example because I am challenged with this at times too. Um, I have a lot of story about my dad. And historically, he's been, in my experience, one of the people that can really fucking get me triggered. And over time of doing lots of exploration about what parts of myself do I see in my father that I hold a lot of criticism for, over time of finding those parts and exploring and integrating and getting to know those truths about who I have been,
mm,
um, it has gotten to a place now where, let's say my dad, I could get triggered by my experience of my dad at a level of like a 10, to now over years, I can hang out with my dad and the experience is much more like a duck in water where his behavior rolls off of my feathers.
mm,
Um, and I believe, I don't know this as fact, I believe that part of that is because I've forgiven myself for the times I've been the same and integrated those things. And also, I've let go to a certain degree the loyalty to who I believe my dad needs to be for me,
mm,
and allowing my dad to be who he is, independent of Jator.
mm,
I no longer need my dad to be my daddy
mm.
in I won't say in any shape or form because that would be a lie. Because as I thought the thought, there was this part of me, this little boy was like, wait a second, my dad that way. So let's just say that's reduced 90%. And now I can sit in a room with my dad and experience him as a man, not as my father.
Mm,
And I don't have the need or less need to approve or disapprove of how he acts in life, because I
mm,
no longer need to utilize him as a way to get my needs met anymore as a little boy. And I think that's just a really important piece, because I cannot think of another place that there's so much richness and width and depth to learn about ourselves than our own parents. Family of origin parents, they are literal blueprints of us, whether we like it or not. And the clearer that we get on that, and the clearer that we get on the parts of us that are still needy of them to be who we want them to be, rather than allowing them to be who they are, that's a part of that individuation process, so that you can then show up with your family, holy shit, and you can be yourself. And you don't need them to change, and they can be themselves.
Ah, mind blown. As I knew that this was going to be epic and exactly what I required for more introspection and growth. So thank you for sharing and being vulnerable. And it certainly resonates on many levels.
I want to kind of stay along those same lines. What you said right there was beautiful, and I think really will be really, really helpful for kind of having that relationship with family and parents. But you kind of posed the question earlier, and I want to come back to it and see if you have an answer. Like, how do we attempt to change those values while still honoring the values of our family of origin?
Yeah. It's a great question. Thank you. I'm still working on it.
It was your question. And it was great. That's how I make sure you get an answer out of you.
Yeah, let's see. Well, I think in some regard, everything that we're kind of dancing with together here is doing that, right? We're bringing our awareness to that. Maybe that actually occurs. And the more we can become aware of our loyalty to those values, and our loyalty and a fear to family of origin, that at least brings up the concept of awareness to open those doors. I'm going to say something pretty frustrating, I think, for many people, inclusive of myself. There's really nothing else that we need to do. Everything else down that path is, I think, can be helpful. But if you can learn the skill of being aware of that in the presence of your family and in yourself as often as possible, that will start to shed the need to hold on to it. It's like, essentially, it's like a secret that we keep. And the more we expose ourselves to the secret, the less the secret holds power over you. And then the more we can talk about the secret. And then we could get really clear on, well, what parts of me are still loyal out of fear to my family of origin? When I set a goal or an intention, what parts of me are doing that because I still need to prove something to my mommy or daddy? When I self-sabotage, what parts of me are acting out that behavior to remind me of my emotional state when I was a child? The more we can get in touch with the parts of us that we're not in touch with, that are still acting out the behaviors, then we can start to acknowledge those parts of self who are desperate to be heard by you. They're no longer in need of the dynamic of being spoken to through the experience of your parents toward them. They're now in need of you reparenting them in a new way, in a new value set. So as we're going through that process, then we'll also get to a place of what part of us still puts our parents up on a pedestal, and what part of us still needs to be loyal to their value sets, and why.
Hmm.
And as we do the same work in there, then we can get clear on evaluating our values through the lens of who do we want to be today, not because we're pissed at our parents or loyal in compliance to our parents. We get to evaluate our values through how do we respect our parents and respect who we want to be moving forward.
Mm.
That's a really convoluted answer. Because there's no real tipping point to that.
Mhm.
It's a constant re-evaluation. Let's see if I can use a hard example. That might make this easier. Okay, so in relationship to each other, and I'll have a lot of experience like this too. You both are in a partnership, and through that partnership, you've experienced, I'm guessing, many times where your values are different. And let's use an easy one. One person thinks that the dishes need to be done immediately. The other person, dishes can just sit around for days on end, no issue.
Have we told you that before? Did you know that's a thing?
So that represents the values that you're very comfortable with, that you both grew up with. It's the right way to do this. Those aren't your values. They've become your values, but they're your parents' values. And now you're in a relationship or partnership with each other, and your two houses are coming with their different values. And so maybe instead of, telling each other what to do, maybe it's an exploration of, oh shit, okay, these are two differing values. Is that even my value? Where did that value come from? How important is that to me? And you doing the same and evaluating together the values. And how true is that for me to hold on to that? And then exploring what parent had that value. And then exploring which parent criticized the other parent and your household for having the opposite value. And so kind of just going through that exploration, and then you two together get to create a new value set in your partnership, in your family, through evaluating where your values came from and really asking yourself, how important is this to me? Is this mine? Is it my parents? And is this something that I can choose to change and explore with my partner to create a new value together? Maybe that's
I like that example. Yeah, absolutely. And I also think, like, as you're saying that, I was just thinking that, like, it's not really my value, it's my parents. But then, as you had mentioned before, it's possibly not even their value. It's just the way that I experienced and assumed their value was based on something that I saw when I was young. So we can really start to, but it's crazy that we have an assumption of somebody else's value, and that is dictating so much of our life when it was never really true. If I went if I went to my mother and was like, we're having a fight about doing the dishes because you didn't want to do the dishes right away, so I don't think, and she's like, well, I just didn't feel like doing it. It's not a value.
Well said. I hope everyone who listens to that recording really listens to the words that you just said.
Mm.
The amount of behaviors that we act out based on the assumption of other people's values is astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
And we each, as an example, we each have tremendous stories about who we think our parents are and why our parents did certain things at certain times in your life.
Mm.
Go have a conversation with your parents about what their perspective was at the same time in your life. Go have a conversation with your brother or sister about the same thing that
Mm.
occurred, and you will see very different experiences, thoughts, emotions, what they made it mean, and then very different ways of then contorting oneself to fit into that family structure in one way or another.
I've found that to be really true. I'm a middle of three boys. So I have an older brother and a younger brother. And there's been a few times we're having conversations. It's like, oh, wait, you didn't see that the same way I did. And they have a completely different
Mm.
perspective of
Mhm.
our childhood. Essentially, it's it's an
Mhm.
8-year gap in between us. So like, we all have really different experiences when you really think about it and talk about it.
Yeah, if regardless of the gap, it's you can take two twins, like
Mhm.
identical twins,
Hmm.
Mhm.
who have a lot of very similar underlying aspects and will have very different experiences, very different body expressions. I mean, it's
Mhm.
fascinating. So, back to the original question, one of the ways that's very practical outside of maybe with your partner is to go ask your parents, like communication 101.
That's so
Hey,
assuming.
have deep conversation with your parents. And if they're not open to deep conversation, just ask the questions and see what happens.
Mm.
I'll have lots of conversations with my parents about past experiences that I made up tremendous stories about as a child. And I'll go ask them simply to hear what was going on in their lives at that time, because in a very interesting way, the more I can humanize my mom and dad, the freer I become.
Mm.
The more I recognize that my parents are as fucked up as I am and doing their best to figure it out with what they had available to them at that time, the less I have them up on a pedestal above me, and the more they come down beside me, and the less I need to then act out behaviors to still get my needs met from my mommy and daddy, who, in some regard, I perceive to never get my needs met, or to rarely get my needs met, or to only sometimes get my needs met, or all the stories that we create about our parents are about 99% false.
Hmm.
Yes,
Yeah, it's a helpful
Is that
perspective.
helpful?
it
Yeah,
is.
I
Yeah,
think very much.
it's super helpful. I kind of want to lean into emotions a bit
Mhm.
and how emotions may be tied to these inner critic thoughts, the sabotage we have, because it, I don't want to speak for Dan, and he can certainly say for himself, but I have found that I am certainly, there's a big part of me that is highly sensitive, very emotional. And it was not well received when I was younger. And so I pushed a lot of my emotions down, whether they be, tears or joy. On the spectrum, I was told I was too emotional, I cried too much, but then I was too perky and too happy, like chill out.
Mhm.
So I kind of didn't know where to go from here. But from that experiences and those stories that I have, I am constantly criticizing myself and am almost hyper vigilant in how I present myself in front of people, because I also am trying to, I guess maybe a part of me is trying to keep myself safe in how other people may respond to me if I get too emotional or, too happy and excited. So I'd love to maybe break down how emotions can kind of tie into these voices and these inner dialogues that we've got.
Yeah. Well, one, I'd just say thank you for being human. I, I don't, I've been coaching for a long time, and I have yet to meet a human who doesn't have your experience.
Mm,
Interesting caveat to that. I have less experience with humans that can put words to that,
yeah.
but yeah, welcome to being a human.
Mm,
We all hide in one way or another, based on our experiences from childhood, um, because in some regard it was scary.
yeah. Very.
And we have a desperate need as children to be taken care of. If you look at that from like a physiological perspective, we're animals that are needy AF for the adults around us because we're helpless. It's a really important point to consider.
Mm,
We're helpless. And so we will figure out whatever way we can to be helped, to get attention, to feel a sense of security, even if that security is insecurity, which is a whole other story. So we will act those things out. Um, and so, when we look at the emotions, the easiest way that I can framework this when it comes to emotions is anytime any of you, inclusive of myself, self-sabotage or notice the inner critic, anytime you hear those voices in your head or act out that behavior, simply ask yourself, what am I feeling emotionally when I do that?
mm,
Whatever that emotion or feeling is, and when I say feeling, I mean sensations in your body, whatever that is often the root of what you're looking to actually experience. So you act out whatever the behavior is to have the emotion and sensation that reminds you who you believe yourself to be based on that family structure that I originally gave voice to.
mm,
So there's a part of us that is desperate for control, familiarity, predictability, fitting in, and we will act out behaviors to ensure that we have the emotional experience and the sensation experience of what's most familiar to us.
mm.
So,
Really interesting.
so, um, and in your case, you had, again, we'd have to chat with your parents because they're not here to represent themselves, but you had the experience that
Mm,
your emotional um, capacity was inappropriate. And so if that's the construct in which you move in, then you will have this hypervigilance around every single person that you're around, because we project our parents everywhere. You'll have that hypervigilance of, I need to figure out as fast as possible, how do I act around this person to stay under their radar, to not get shamed for being, hey, or to not get shamed for that.
Mm.
So I'm projecting, your hypervigilance is probably driven by some level of fear.
Mm.
And underneath that, some level of core identity that you are flawed. Shame. So shame as an emotion is different than shame as an identity.
Mm.
And if we self-identify as flawed, which most of us do, then we will continue to act out that hypervigilant behavior to remind us of our flaw.
Mm.
If I said to you, you're going to walk into a room and be exactly who you experience yourself to be internally, and no one's going to react to that in a positive or negative way, my guess is you'd freeze. Like, I don't even know what the fuck you're talking about right now.
Deer in headlights.
Can't even imagine that. Deer in headlights. Ego frozen. Familiar gets searched out then.
Mm. Mm.
So in real time then, so we can do all this exploration, but in real time, the beauty, I think, of a partnership is where you get to practice this stuff. So Dan gets to be in real time the person that attempts to say to you, I love you and appreciate you as you are. And there's parts of you that are going to annoy the fuck out of me, and I want to get to know those too, and they're okay here as well. And he gets to be, and you get to be, and y'all get to be the playground in which your hypervigilance gets to slowly dissipate. Because you're getting to have the real-time experience of another human who's at least willing to try to accept more, I'm going to say of you, but really more of him in his experience of you. And the more that happens, it could be with a best friend, it could be with a partner, it could be with a coach, whatever. That new experience then can build into your nervous system and give you the courage, to do that in other environments that aren't as safe. Right? So let's say he's the safest. Maybe you have a best friend that's level 2, you practice that. Coach, maybe level 3. And as you're building that and shedding the need, this is fucking crazy shit right here. Shedding the need in Dan's presence, there will be a part of you that is desperate for him to act out the expected behavior of everybody else that you've been around. Even when he's not doing it. Even when he's saying, babe, I'm here. I'm telling you, I'm present. There's a part of me that's scared. There's a part of me that's annoyed. And I still want to be here with you. I want to work this with you. I want you to feel safe enough to have that whole spectrum with me.
Mm.
There's a sliver of you that won't believe that
Mm.
and won't be able to see it. And that also takes time and commitment to that work, because these things are so deeply rooted that as soon as we get into an environment in which the association is close enough to an experience that we have with our parents or family of origin,
Mm.
i.e. association, you are emotionally attached to Dan, so there's the association right there. As soon as that happens, every experience as childhood of who you've been emotionally attached to get your needs met will play out.
Mm.
You'll have to be so cognizant and so aware to trust yourself to change the story in his presence. It's real hard work,
Yeah.
and it's
But I
not
love it.
easy.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I do too.
It's really cool because it like aligns a lot with like kind of things I've been thinking lately and like
Mhm.
awareness I've been recognizing.
Yeah.
We're
Before you
Oh,
say
sorry.
to interrupt you, I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for sharing the perspective and your opinion and how we
Mm.
can work and grow
Mhm.
further on this, and to give the listeners context. So it's extremely beneficial and a wonderful reminder. And there's always more to look deeper into
Mhm.
each other for. So thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
I was
you.
just gonna say like a lot lately, having a little awareness kind of along those same lines, where almost like when in the moments when Elise is being hyper vigilant and
Mhm.
annoying the fuck out of me, um, for the first time in the 20 years we've been together, having a lot of empathy around that and realizing like,
Mm.
wow, if this is how she's acting toward me, like what's actually going on in her head? How is she
Mm.
acting toward herself?
Mm.
And so I think with what you just said, it's like a really exciting way to explore that and support that and just keep bringing more awareness to it. Um,
Yeah, it's another challenge in here is that because you're both emotionally attached to each other, the paradox of emotional attachment in a very interesting way is those are the people we need to hide the most from.
Mm-hmm.
mhm. Yeah.
And so let's just say she's being hyper vigilant. Um, and that, let's say that's apparent to both of you, like, hey babe, I experienced you to be pretty hyper vigilant. She's like, yeah, I'm pretty much there. um the other piece of this is you get to say, babe, there's a part of me that's annoyed,
Mm.
and she gets to hear that as honesty, not as shame.
Mhm.
Mm.
And she gets to be okay that you are annoyed, and she still gets to be herself.
Mm.
And the more honesty that you all can grow with each other around what is challenging each other, yourselves about each other, the more intimacy you actually grow.
Mm.
And the more intimacy with each other that you're growing, the more intimacy you're truly growing with yourself. And the more self-trust you have to be more outspoken about your truths. And the more present you guys both get to be in those spaces, the less pushing another away becomes in those moments, i.e., um, you're annoyed, you're hyper vigilant, and you're not able to see where I'm coming from. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense? So if
Yeah.
Dan
Yep.
says that, it's a very slippery place where both people become defended and then start to separate. You get to hear each other, you get to challenge each other, and you both get to be open to you're both blind at times. You know what, babe? Maybe I'm not fully coming from this place of acceptance right now. Let me check in with that. It's a very, very hard place for both people to
Mhm.
be, especially when we're so driven to prove and defend, and we're so driven to hide and keep stories from each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, asking the question always, um, can we do this better together?
Mm.
How do we become more honest with each other, and how do we create space that it's okay to be honest? Um, Dan, her hypervigilance reminds you of a part of your own hypervigilance that you
Mhm.
deny. I don't know how you experience Dan, but maybe his stoicism at times that annoys you reminds you of a part of you that is stoic and in denial at times.
Mm.
When you get to those places and own that, the mirror becomes less convoluted. And as I said earlier, then you get to grow this skill to then move into places that are scarier to move, like your parents or
Mm.
like the outside world.
Mm.
Um, so to take that away, in essence, in our behaviors, we're often searching for the underlying denied emotion.
Mm. Yes.
Yeah.
That was beautifully spoken. And as we've grown and continue to grow and
Mm.
shed kind of almost really the death and rebirth kind of process of us individually, it also gives us the opportunity to do that together. And we're also just trying to rediscover these newer parts of us while not neglecting the older parts that have been with both of us for so long. And yes, many of those placed in our shadow, if you will, to
Mhm.
to things. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful reminder there.
There was a time in a partnership that my partner said, "You're being um, really condescending right now," and I had to take a pause and evaluate myself, and I said, "You know what? You're right,
Mm,
and I
mm,
apologize."
mm.
We
Yeah.
have to be able to reflect in the moment and take ownership and explore, and we also have to carve out time for
Yes.
these
Mhm.
deep, intimate conversations to happen, which it can't happen in front of the TV or over dinner or when, I don't know, kids and shit are crying around. You have to make this an important part of your self experience if you're on your own, or in yourself and in a partner experience. You need to carve out time for those deep conversations to occur.
It's how we evolve.
Mhm.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So along these same lines, something I have definitely dealt with a lot over the years is sort of the idea of the imposter syndrome, which I feel like is very, very closely tied to the inner critic and the saboteur. How do you see sort of the role of the imposter syndrome kind of fitting in here and just kind of feeling like we're not enough?
Yeah, I think um, you know, we could take everything we've talked about and then just, reframe whether it's inner critic and then talk about imposter.
Mhm.
Mm.
Um, there's a lot of labels, but as a general theme, the amount of shame experiences that one has as a child, there is a point in which that stops becoming an emotion and it becomes a self-identity, as we've kind of tapped into before. And I want to be really clear, like shame as an emotion is a beautiful emotion and actually has a lot of upside to it. And there's a lot of shame about shame out there right now. And I just say that it's a complex topic, but for a deep dive into shame, I'd invite anyone to check out John Bradshaw's Healing the Shame That Binds You, and, ingest that book about 10 times over, and then you might get some semblance of how deep it runs. The imposter syndrome also goes back to this idea of loyalty to family. As an easy question for you to consider, or for everyone to consider, who do you still not feel like you're enough for? What brother of yours do you put up on a pedestal as more than you? What brother outshines you, in your perspective? When did you start to dumb yourself down as to not outshine your older brother, typically your older brother? The imposter can be a way, Dan and others, to keep yourself locked in that idea of who you believe yourself to be in the family structure. As an example, for my own life, there was a time, I must have been 23 or something. I come from a family that's very well educated and has all of the degrees and the whole list of cool things. And there was a time I was maybe 23 and I was personal training, and I was making more an hour than my dad was. My dad's super highly educated, multiple degrees, PhD, blah, blah, blah. He freaked out. How the hell are you making more than me? Now, the reason why I'm giving this example is that I'm 23 years old, so we're using an older Jator example. But what it's also demonstrating is the type of mind that I was raised by.
Yeah.
Who are you to outshine me? And many parents have a really hard time with this. While there is absolutely truth that you want your child to outshine you, there's also threat to your child outshining you.
Yeah.
Dad, mom, brothers, etc. And so if we experience that when we're children, again, we're looking for ways to get attention because kids associate attention with being loved. So we figure out how to do it. Well, shit, if my older brother is, shining on and I can't compete with that, I'm going to dumb myself down to hide. The middle child typically is the overlooked child. It's no surprise to me that you feel a sense of imposter syndrome, because in your experience, I'm guessing you didn't feel seen. You had one on top getting attention for firstborn, one below for getting attention for being lastborn. That's a challenging place to be. It's no more challenging than the other ones, but it makes sense then as a thought experiment that if a part of you didn't feel seen, Dan, then how the fuck are you going to see yourself? How are you even going to be able to acknowledge your value? How are you going to be able to get to a place of even I can be satisfied with where I'm at. And all of your and ours behavior then, whether you know it or not, will continue to act out in ways to ensure that you're overlooked.
Mhm.
Not
Mm.
some ultra spiritual shit, just some grassroots family dynamics. Um, this is my place. So, like, one of the keys to that imposter is what part of you feels like an imposter? Where does that stem from? When was the first experience that you were like, man, I do not belong, or I'm not enough, or I'm overlooked, or no matter what I do, I'm not seen, or who am I trying to prove myself to? Um, how many times did I look for the celebration of what I do rather than who I am? And if we're so outcome driven, and we're so driven to be seen by others for our accomplishments, often because as children we weren't acknowledged simply because we are, uh, it plays out this story of you're never enough. Or when people meet the real me, they're going to realize it's a facade.
That gives me a lot to think about.
I was just thinking to myself, I'm actually really looking forward to going back and watching this so that I can write all these as journal prompts. This is a double expiration,
Mhm.
but yeah, this is, gosh, so much to think about. I truly appreciate your honesty, expertise, and opinion, because so much of the deep life and what it is really not finding answers to things. It's being
Mm.
able to ask deeper questions that just bring about more questions.
Hmm. Yeah, I love questions. Um, and I I often I would say I don't think there's a lot of answers. There's more questions and more exploration, and I think answers often give us a sense of kind of maybe taking the sword off the grind. This work can be fiery and tense and exposing, and it's also very appropriate to take time out and take a rest and let that steel cool off, and then go back to sharpening it again. Um, but I'd also say that in that same space of what we were talking about, really examining your family dynamics
Mm.
is really, really useful to starting to get some contextual understanding of who you think you need to be within that family structure. And the more parts of you that are still attached to being that version of yourself, the harder it is to change today. Um,
Mhm.
we're we're often, little kids dressed up in adult suits, and yeah, deeply exploring your loyalty to your family and family values. You asked about the saboteur or the imposter. There could be a stream of you believing that as a part of who you are, because that helped you fit in and get attention within your family
Mhm.
dynamics.
Mm.
Um, this also works for like victim mentality, being a
Mhm.
victim or being pathetic. etc. It also works on the opposite spectrum, being a guru or being the all-knowing. In a very interesting way, that's the opposite side of toxic shame, where you believe you're more than human.
Mm.
So there's a lot of really interesting interplay there, and so much to learn from our families, and so much to learn from watching our parents,
Mm.
and observing them, and so much to learn from really observing and watching ourselves as we interact with our families. There's so much meat on those bones to finding your way out of these constructs.
For sure. Oh my gosh, so much to unpack and so much wisdom, Jator. Oh, amazing.
Cool.
When we spoke about a month ago, whenever it was, and we were catching up, and I was explaining the very intense year that we had with everything going on, and my sister, sister passing. You turned to Dan and asked him, "Wow, how were you feeling when all of this went on?" And I'll let him take over from there.
Yeah. I'll say, like, well, first, this is, I feel like, a really good example of what you were describing earlier, as far as we, like, when things happen, we're seeking the feelings that we're familiar with rather than experiencing what's actually happening. And so I feel like I felt like a deer in headlights when you asked me. And when we got off the call, I said to Elise, in the past, however long it's been now, Jator was the first person who asked me how I felt. Besides, Elise was the other one, but she had asked me. But even then, it was like, for me, it was hard to, almost like, it's not the right way to say it, but I'll say take that seriously, because nothing against her. It was like the way that I had dealt with the situation. It was like really hard, and like the loss was really difficult for me. But the hardest part was watching Elise go through what she was going through and feeling like really helpless about it. And like there was nothing I could do to help her at all. It was just like literally sitting there and watching for months while she suffered and cried. So when the time came for me to feel sad, there was also a part of me that was basically telling me I don't deserve to be sad, because I'm not as sad as she is, or I'm not as sad as other people are, which is really interesting. And I think it ties in so much with what we're talking about here, where I think there was a part of me that was judging me, and just not think, like, there was like this belief that I wasn't worthy of the sadness. And I think a lot of that does kind of tie into, very similar to what Elise was saying. It's like when I was young, I was very emotional, and I would be made fun of. My family would like make fun of me when I cried or showed too much emotion. It was a lot of sarcasm and a lot of these little snide, "Oh, you're so emotional," like, and brushing it off. So like I felt like in the moment, I think I was doing that to myself, and like judging myself for being sad. Which is interesting. It's an
So
interesting.
much,
Being a human is crazy.
so much
Well,
juice here.
Yeah. Well, when he ever said that to me after we got off the Zoom call, about a month ago, I was like, oh my gosh, because I remember the answer that he gave didn't seem very heartfelt.
Yeah, I meant to say that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like that's what I meant when I said, like, there's like this deer in headlights kind of thing. I had never thought about how to talk about what I had gone through, because nobody had asked me. Whereas like Elise had answered that and told that story multiple times over and over. It was like, not to say it wasn't authentic, but there was sort of like a practice in talking about it. And I still hadn't really brought words into the situation. I had just kind of felt it and didn't have that story with it.
Yeah. Oh man, so good. I would agree. There's so many cool threads here. One of the threads that I pick up on is many of us suffer over others' suffering.
Mhm.
And because we suffer over others' suffering, and as you said, you couldn't fix it or make it better, we suffer even more. So you're suffering over her suffering, and then you're suffering over not being able to have your suffering about what you experienced.
Mhm.
And in that same weird place is a lot of codependency, and goes back to when we were children about how do we make sure that everyone else is okay? How do we parent everyone else
Mhm.
so that we don't have to suffer over everyone else suffering? And it's really important that she gets to have her experience and her pain and all of that. It's as important that you get to have that too in the same space, and one doesn't need to take away from the other. That's a codependent thought,
Mhm.
that you having your experience will take away from hers, or you don't deserve to have it. It's so important that we, as a couple, allow both people to have their full emotional expression around whatever is happening in their lives. And that becomes a very supportive growth space. And the more that we can do that together, the less codependent we are,
Mhm.
Mm.
and the less masks we have to wear. Um, and as you said, Dan, it's so, probably stems back to your childhood and who you believe yourself to be. And when I rewind back to the experience with you
Mhm.
guys, my assumption was that no one asked you.
Mhm.
And I was really curious because I was watching Elise speak and share, and I was, mhm. And I was watching you, and there wasn't anything, at least that I could see, being
Mhm.
expressed.
Mm. Yes.
And for me, it's such a beautiful moment to build a bridge between you two,
Mm.
of both of you being able to have your experiences with each other, and learning to do that, and celebrating each other in that way is, from my opinion, absolutely necessary. Um, so thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you for asking
Yeah.
in the first place.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring it back up. Fabulous. All right. We have just enjoyed this conversation, have taken so many wonderful nuggets of wisdom, like I said, that you've shared, and we'll continue to integrate and unpack a lot of what has transpired here. So we again cannot thank you enough for sharing this space, for holding space, and for coming as your human of the experience of Jator and what he's accumulated, wealth of knowledge, and so grateful for you, of course. If anybody is more interested in finding out how to get in touch with you, or where to, look at all of your wonderful words of wisdom, where can we direct people?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you so much again. And the questions and the willingness to kind of swim around in all of this weirdness. I think it's rare and really cool. So thank you for that. I think my handle pretty much everywhere is at Jator Pierre.
Perfect.
So that's pretty easy. And I'll send y'all a link to my newsletter and my coaching program, which will be in October, third cohort. But that's my main places, in Instagram. But I like my newsletter and
We
doing
do too.
this
Yeah.
more so.
A lot of great
It's worth
information.
signing up for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jator.
Awesome. Thank you so much.